Welcome to CharityVillage Connects. I'm Mary Barrell. According to the 2022 Canadian Survey on Disability, the employment rate for persons with disabilities currently sits at 62%. While this figure has risen in recent years, up from 59% in the 2017 survey, it's clear that a lot more progress should be made in creating more inclusive and accessible workplaces for Canadians with disabilities. We're talking to accessibility experts from across the sector to find out about the challenges and barriers that contribute to this employment gap, along with what nonprofit organizations can do to address these barriers within workplaces, programming, and communities. Joining me to discuss these important issues is Wanda Deschamps, founder of Liberty Co., a consultancy focused on increasing neurodiverse employment with a special emphasis on autism due to Wanda's own diagnosis at midlife. Her approach is centered on the IDEA framework, an acronym for Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Accessibility, and highlights inclusive leadership, entrepreneurial thinking, and employee retention. Prior to founding Liberty Co., Wanda enjoyed a 25-year career in the philanthropic sector, serving with leading Canadian institutions. Now a neuro-inclusion thought leader combining theory, practical strategies, and lived experience, she partners with public, private, and nonprofit organizations. Welcome to the podcast, Wanda.
Thanks so much.
I'd love to hear a little bit about your own journey, what led you to start Liberty Co., and what work you're focusing on now.
Well, as you mentioned in the introduction, I did enjoy a 25-year career in the charitable sector. And so when I founded Liberty Co., I thought it was going to be a service to the charitable sector because that was my professional background. And if you imagine a split screen, at the same time that I launched Liberty Co., I was processing my new diagnosis of autism that I received a month before my 47th birthday. So I was becoming increasingly aware of advocacy that was happening in the space, but it was separate from the launch of Liberty Co. with its focus on the charitable sector. And then the more I became aware of the need to increase stories of autistics in the workplace, and especially autistic women. And I was encouraged to share my own story because I found out there's a dearth of stories, actually, that people have available in terms of awareness of neurodiversity and autism in the workplace, and especially women. I realized that my advocacy was going to become my work. So I reoriented Liberty Co. before the pandemic to focus on neurodiverse employment. And so that was a wonderful decision, it turns out to be. And that's how we got to where we are today.
Well, can you talk about neurodiversity, what it means and what it encompasses?
So neurodiversity is a term that was coined by Australian sociologist Judy Singer in the 1990s to refer to naturally occurring differences across human brain makeups. So the reality is that every brain is unique. If we dig a bit deeper, neurodivergence are the differences, the umbrella terms. So for instance, autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia. These are forms of neurodivergence. And neurodiversity really reflects that differences in interaction and communication and social communication, whatnot. Again, these are naturally occurring. The fact that neurodivergent individuals process information differently, we interact differently. This is nothing to be erased or cured in any way. We're neurodivergent because our brains are wired differently. And then neurotypical, that's the majority of the population. Those are individuals whose brains are not wired differently. So they do not diverge in a way. Neurotypical brains are the dominant type. And so sometimes the reason I highlight this, Mary, is sometimes the terms are used interchangeably, and neurodiversity, neurodivergence, neurotypical, neurodivergent, these are all different terms. And so kind of a baseline understanding can be helpful for folks.
Yeah, that's helped me a lot, actually. I hadn't appreciated the nuances in terms of the difference. They clearly have quite a different meaning, and I appreciate you explaining that for myself and the audience. You had a long career in the charitable sector prior to founding Liberty Co. Can you tell us a bit more about what it was like working in the sector as a neurodivergent individual?
Well, for the majority of the time, I didn't know I was a neurodivergent individual. So everything I share with you is in the space of a retrospective. So I received the diagnosis a month before my 47th birthday, and I had been employed in the charitable sector for 25 years. So what I say when I talk about my career is that I existed in a duality. And there was always two stories. There was always outside and inside, or outward and inward. So outwardly, I was successful, depending on your definition of success. So I was consistently promoted. I had the opportunity to work both as an employee and as a consultant. I was able to move regions within the country. And so there was always that story. However, inwardly, it was very different. I had high levels of anxiety. I was confused about how I came across often to other people. There was conflict in the workplace, and I didn't know why. And I constantly tried to change and modify and improve. I would say that I always came from the perspective of continuous improvement. However, it seemed like nothing was ever good enough. There was always this weight on me to change. Well, now I know why. Going back to the definitions we shared at the top, my brain is wired differently than the majority of the population, which means that I do interact differently than many others. I process information differently, and I feel things differently. So, in a nutshell, what was my experience like? There were many good experiences, and there were a lot of challenges too. And what really motivates me is that I want a smoother path for others. I don't want people to experience a lot of the challenges that I did, and so that's why I founded Liberty Co. and continue the work that I do.
Did it come as a relief to understand with the diagnosis of why you felt these things and experienced these things?
So that's actually very insightful of you to say, because that was the word that I used in response to receiving my diagnosis from the diagnosing professional. I said, it's a relief, because I received answers to so many questions which I thought were inexplicable. I didn't think I would receive this kind of information in my lifetime that caused everything to finally make sense. I say it felt like a missing piece of my brain was suddenly in place for the first time. It's been over 7 years now, and I realize I'm going to be on this journey for the rest of my life, understanding and processing. Overall, yes, it was a relief, and it's been a really positive experience to receive my diagnosis.
I'm glad to hear that. I wonder, from your perspective, how can workplaces and managers of workplaces do a better job of supporting neurodivergent people? What should they be doing to create more inclusive workplaces?
Well, the number one thing would be to recognize that neurodiversity exists. So we're looking at 15 to 20% of the Canadian population, or the world's population, in fact, of being neurodivergent. And underdiagnosis persists. Look at me. So while that 15 to 20% statistic does take into account, a degree of underdiagnosis, it could still be beyond, 20%. That's a significant part of the population. So to realize that neurodiversity exists, as I mentioned at the top, Judy Singer's vision, these are naturally occurring differences. Every brain is unique. And for those of us who are neurodivergent, who have forms of neurodivergence like autism, that we have a lot to contribute. That different is not bad. And in fact, we have a lot to contribute, not despite of our differences, but because of our differences. So I think it's important for workplaces to realize that neurodiversity actually can lead to innovation. Because we do think differently, process information differently, feel things differently. We can approach problem solving, coming from different ways. And so to recognize neurodiversity exists, neurodivergent individuals have much to contribute. Workplaces can learn more about neurodiversity. They can center neurodivergent voices. And then they can normalize, once they become more aware, they can normalize the conversation about neurodiversity in the workplace. They can build it into their communications. They can highlight neurodiversity in workplace communications and job postings. And they can look at neurodiversity and the opportunities around neurodivergent hiring. They can look at neurodiversity actually through the entire employee life cycle.
Well, as mentioned off the top in the introduction, we know that people with disabilities are underemployed in Canada. And this includes neurodivergent people who may be more likely to be unemployed or underemployed. Why do you think this is the case? Are there biases that employers should be addressing within themselves and their organizations?
Well, if you look at biases, accessibility barriers, the number one barrier is attitudinal. So if you go right back to, what does neurodiversity mean, and what can this mean specifically for neurodivergent individuals, we come across differently, and there's a bias, and frankly, there's a stigma that different is bad. And because we interact differently, because we process information, because we come across differently, that this is a bad thing. So that's a huge barrier right there. These biases against us. So that's a large reason. Another reason is because of outdated hiring practices. The charitable sector is not immune to this, like any other sector that has frankly been practicing in outdated ways, as opposed to adapting their practices to be more inclusive. I mentioned a few minutes ago job postings and looking at your communication. So going right back, looking at recruitment at its core, making sure that you're being inclusive, that you are adapting to new approaches, and that you really truly want diversity among your team, including all facets of diversity, including neurodiversity. Again, when you consider the percentage of the population, it is significant.
Absolutely. And one of the arguments for diversity, particularly in the workplace, in the nonprofit sector, is that it's important to reflect the communities that the nonprofit sector serves. And, that includes neurodivergent people and people with disabilities, other kinds of disabilities. And I wonder, from your perspective in working in the nonprofit sector for as long as you have, how much of that is an important aspect that nonprofit leaders should be thinking about?
It's really, really important. So, for instance, when you consider the percentage of the population, everything from your board makeup to your leadership composition to your team composition, increasingly we're looking at different aspects of diversity. However, often disability and neurodiversity are still not part of considering that makeup. And so, yes, you have neurodivergent donors, you have disabled donors, whether you know it, whether they know it. The majority of disabilities are invisible. That largely includes neurodiversity, although there's some conditions, there's some forms of neurodivergence such as Tourette's where aspects may be visible. However, we're largely looking at invisible differences. And so it's so important to consider. It's so important that neurodivergent minds, disabled individuals are considered as part of the rich fabric of diversity across your organization. So you will have disabled donors. You will have disabled volunteers. And something that really struck me and continues to strike me actually is that disability organizations, and sometimes even neurodiversity organizations, they don't have commensurate representation of neurodivergent or disabled individuals. So for instance, disability centered organizations can have abled people, sometimes entirely in its leadership ranks, or disproportionately. And it's so important that we're represented. It's important that we are represented across every organization. However, it's especially important for disability and neurodiversity focused organizations. I think that there is more awareness of this important. I think over time, people are frankly going to expect it. But that is something that has been really surprising to me. And, as I mentioned to you, everything now is a retrospective because I was in the charitable sector. I didn't have eye diagnosis. However, I did notice that there was an absence of disabled leaders. There was an absence of disabled, openly, I should say, openly disabled employees, openly disabled leaders. And I noticed while I was still in the charitable sector and I was becoming attuned to my own diagnosis, I did notice that I didn't hear very many other people openly saying that they were neurodivergent. And so if you go right back to, the first question you asked me about the founding of Liberty Co., it's really been a motivation for me. We need more individuals, neurodivergent individuals at all levels within the charitable sector, including the leadership levels. And I do believe that over time this will change.
I wonder, in that vein, are there some practical steps that organizations can take to do a better job of recruiting people with disabilities as well as neurodivergent people?
Well, I've already mentioned including neurodiversity and disability in workplace communications and in job postings. However, if we move through the cycle, reimagining interview techniques, doing things like sending interview questions in advance, rethinking the need for resumes. Often neurodivergent individuals and disabled individuals can have non-linear career paths because of attitudinal barriers, because of stigma and biases that we face. So there may be nonlinear paths, gaps in employment. So rethink your resume process. So you're focusing more on getting to know the whole individual and not just certain aspects of the person's employment history. Ensure that your interview team is diverse in makeup. If possible, train team members on inclusive interviewing, considering neurodiversity. Show people the job. I always say this. Looking back at my interviews, they didn't show me what the job was like on the day-to-day. They focused more on the relationship between me and who was going to be my supervisor. But when you think about the job on the day-to-day, that's an important aspect. It's only one aspect. It doesn't really show you what the job entails and really how the team interacts. So consider those. And then, consider inclusive practices in terms of onboarding, retention, fostering an environment where everyone is heard and fairly understood. Focus on communication in a way that suspends judgment, that celebrates differences, doesn't expect everyone to be the same. There's so many tips for communication on the day-to-day that can be truly inclusive and consider neurodiversity. Things for, meetings, sending agendas and materials in advance, communicating in multiple formats, considering neurodiversity and inclusion in your change management practices. And Mary, probably something that you're picking up on here is what I'm saying. These can have broad application for so many folks. Not just, they're good for neurodivergent and disabled individuals. However, so many practices that increase accessibility, that increase inclusion, that take into account diversity, they're actually good for everyone. And that's something that comes up in a lot in my work. What's good for the neurodivergent and disabled population has actually much wider application for the general population.
Well, I just want to follow up on that because you have commented before that what's good for those who are autistic or neurodivergent, it's good for everyone. Can you expand on that and give us your vision of what an inclusive, accessible workplace might look like? What is it that, how is it good for everyone?
So, to give you an example, feedback that I got was that my communication could be overly direct. I felt like I was being honest and helpful. So to apply how a manner that can, play to talent, can play to people's contributions is really understand the perspective that people are coming from. Again, suspend judgment and actually come to a place where you're truly curious about the person. So Wanda, tell me more about, please help me understand. Try to attach the person's reasoning to a way that could be helpful to the group, because I really wanted to be helpful. I really felt that deep down that's what I was doing, that I was trying to be helpful. So I was looking for people that were going to suspend their judgment and that were going to approach me in good faith and focus on how I could and was contributing to the team, and that we as a team, could do good things for the organization. So if you take autism, you take neurodiversity away from that, Mary, and you just insert name of neurotypical person. I mean, wouldn't that be good for anyone? Suspending judgment, focusing on the contributions people can make, how the team can be stronger, how we can work towards common goals together. And that is the theme. That is the thing. What's good for one person, say one autistic or neurodivergent individual. If you come from those perspectives, those are great actually approaches for anyone.
Well, personally, I like people who are direct, so I wouldn't have any issue with that, frankly. But I know you also work on issues related to gender equity. Would you say that there's an intersection between gender and disability that needs more attention?
There definitely is. So women and gender diverse individuals experience that double bind. The barriers that I talked about before. Uh, Number one, primary attitudinal, and it takes form in stigma and discrimination. So disabled and neurodivergent individuals definitely experience those, and then add to that the double bind of sexism and other forms of discrimination related to gender. So yes, we definitely do need to understand more about this. Again, it's one of the reasons why I was encouraged to share my own story. When you think about portrayals in media and stories that have been told about autism and neurodiversity, often from the perspective of white men, and not as many women or gender diverse individuals come to mind. So yes, we definitely need to understand it more. We need to consider it. And so, everything that I shared about considering the makeup in the charitable sector of board members in leadership ranks across teams, we need to consider that both in terms greater diversity around disability, neurodivergence, and gender, and when they intersect. Um, Again, another thing is that the double bind, and I can experience it. I did experience it. And we go back to the example that I shared. When I was given the feedback, I was overly direct, and I communicated differently, and that was from both the perspective of ableism and sexism, because I noticed in these environments, and as men weren't getting that feedback, and in fact it was the opposite. I noticed men around me who were direct. They were praised for their honesty, their straightforwardness, and not only were they not discriminated against, they were often promoted. and compensated for those differences. So yeah, so much more to understand. And then if we added, Mary, to that, if we added race, and ethnicity, religion to neurodivergence and gender, again, the barriers would increase. So much more that we need to understand. The richness of our diversity is a strength.
I think that's such an excellent example, because I was thinking very much about when we talk about that intersectionality of gender and neurodivergent, and especially how it manifests itself with your being told that you were too direct. That's the first thing that came to my mind, was that no one would say that to men. And so I think that's a very intuitive and important observation, that this intersectionality can really impact women, particularly women in a sector that's the majority of workers are women. It's really an important aspect to consider. I'd like to know what your thoughts are around leadership roles and diversity within the nonprofit sector, especially related to gender and disability. What do you think needs to change here, and why?
Well, I think I've covered that it does need to change for all the reasons that I just shared, going back to the top. I mean, the majority of the neurodiverse population is either unemployed or underemployed. And so the unemployment rate of autistics can be as high as 80%. So if we turn that, the employment rate of autistics can be as low as around 20%, depending on which study you're looking at and circumstances and so on. So it needs to change. And we've already talked about why it needs to change. And that is because your board, your leadership team, your team needs to reflect the population, and it needs to reflect your community of donors and supporters, stakeholders, those who are committed to your mission. So, we've covered so much, that it does need to change. I'm going to offer something a little different because of my experience in the charitable sector. And that is, I really believe that women need to support other women more if we're going to see gains, especially around women in the leadership ranks of the charitable sector. So I did notice, Mary, that the majority of the employees in the charitable sector were women, but yet we didn't dominate at the leadership ranks. That so often those in the leadership positions in the charitable sector, on board and in organizational leadership positions, were men. And so I was always very concerned about this and disappointed, frankly. And I felt that it needed to change. And one of the ways I felt it needed to change, and I still do, is that women need to support other women. So the example that I gave to you before about, receiving the feedback that I was overly direct and, men weren't receiving that feedback, those comments were often from other women. They, in fact, weren't necessarily from men. Sometimes they were. I'm not going to deny that. And I'm not going to deny the important role that men have to play as allies and in combating sexism in the charitable sector, in every sector. However, I believe something that we really need to do is help create environments and foster these environments where women can support other women. Because if women are the majority of the employees, then if women at the top are mistreated or they're exited, then we have reason to think that many women were involved in that decision. So that's a huge part. And then another way, another area where I really think can be addressed is going back to something that I said before, but really normalizing the conversation. So, if we're looking at board recruitment, we're looking at leadership recruitment, really embedding neurodiversity in recruitment. We still have a long way to go, I think, in terms of educating recruiters. So especially professional firms, recruiting agencies around disability and neurodiversity. So many people still think, if they are at all thinking about disability and neurodiversity, so many people still think that it belongs in the junior levels of an organization, in frontline positions, contract, precarious employment. And I always say, and it's really important that there's disabled individuals in contract positions, in the front lines. Of course, it belongs at all levels, though. And so we're still not looking at it enough in terms of recruitment at the most senior levels. And so increasing awareness, those working in the recruitment field is really, really important. Because in the work that I do have a focus on allyship. And I do work with organizations and understanding what allyship in this context means and what individuals can do. However, if these practices are not demonstrated from the top, it almost doesn't matter how strong an ally base you have. The efforts will flounder. We need leadership demonstrating the importance of inclusion, and if it's around neurodiversity and disability in those areas, normalizing the conversation, developing plans that are actually actionable and measurable. How are we going to move the needle in terms of neurodiverse and disabled inclusion right across the board? So much more I could say. Those are just some of the things.
Well, as we wrap up today, I'd really like to bring you back to something that we touched on earlier and, hear from you to expand on why including disability within the broader conversations of diversity is so very important.
Because disability exists across every race, every ethnicity, every gender, every sexual orientation, every religious group. So all races, all ethnicities, all genders, all sexual orientations have members who are disabled and or neurodivergent. When I say or, it just depends on your definition. Some people consider neurodiversity a form of disability. Some people do not. So whether or not you do, neurodiversity and disability exists across the richness of all of our diversity. So I say it's so important because disability and accessibility really underpin all of DEI or IDE. I say if you think of a door, and so much of DEI or IDE happens after you enter the door, then we're leaving out a really large segment of the population if we're not considering accessibility for neurodivergent and disabled individuals. If we can't even get through the door, that's why I highlight job postings and communications about your workplace. If we can't even get an interview, if we don't even get a callback, then for us, it's secondary if there's all kinds of programs and efforts in the workplace around IDE and DEI, because we can't even get in. And then even if we do secure employment, often we're isolated and excluded in the workplace. And so the barriers do not end once we secure a job. So it's really time to change our thinking. We've made progress in terms of DEI and IDE. So many organizations still don't add that A for accessibility when they're developing programs, strategies, and plans. Add that A. When you consider the practical perspective of sheer numbers, it's really, really important. We consider the moral imperative that we are human beings and we have the right to be employed. And then when you consider that disability and neurodiversity exist across every group, as I say, every equity-seeking group has members who are neurodivergent and disabled, then it's a really strong case.
Well, Wanda, I'd like to thank you for your advocacy and work to improve accessibility and inclusion for people with disabilities in the workplace and generally in society, along with your invaluable advice to nonprofits and charities across Canada about how to break down barriers and make their workplaces, programs, and communities more welcoming and accessible. Thank you for joining Charity Village Connects.
Thanks so much for the opportunity, Mary.